Greetings and cordial welcome to the event jointly hosted by the Center for Global Development and the World Bank, focusing on World Bank's April 2024 South Asia Development Update. I'm Sanjeev Gupta, Senior Fellow Emeritus at the Center for Global Development. The South Asia region is expected to be the fastest growing among emerging markets and developing economies globally in the coming years. This remarkable growth trajectory, accounting for over 15% of global growth in recent years, is primarily attributable to the robust expansion in India, with promising signs of growth in other South Asian economies as well. However, amidst this optimism, challenges persist. The region's growth has predominantly relied on public sector, while private sector investment remains lackluster. Consequently, the region grapples with high public debt and substantial interest payments, constraining investments in sustainable development goals and climate adaptation efforts. Compounded by suboptimal revenue ratios, the fiscal outlook of the region appears discouraging. Adding to this complexity is the vulnerability of a significant proportion of the population to the impacts of climate change, with an average 60 million people annually affected by natural disasters. Since 2010, the fiscal constraints limit government's capacity to adequately address climate-related challenges, thereby burdening household farms and businesses. Moreover, the region faces challenges in generating non-agricultural employment opportunities, resulting in sluggish employment growth compared to its rising working-age population. Notably, South Asia stands out as the only region witnessing a decline in men's employment as a share of the working-age population since 2000, with women's employment also lagging substantially behind. Without requisite policy adjustments, harnessing the demographic dividend and sustaining high growth rates will remain challenging. In today's deliberations, we aim to explore policy interventions crucial for sustaining high growth rates in South Asia region. To kick off our proceedings, we have Francisca Ponstorge, the World Bank Chief Economist for South Asia, present the key findings of the April 2024 update. Prior to the bank, Francisca was in the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development and International Monetary Fund. Following her presentation, Francisca will participate in our panel discussion. Francisca, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Big thank you to CGD for co-hosting this event with us. Thank you, Sanjeev, for making this happen. And thank you, Lavish, for joining us. So let me start sharing. The growth in South Asia is indeed faster than it is elsewhere. Here you go. You can see that here in the chart on the left. It shows you growth prospects for South Asia, what we call SAR, and other emerging markets and developing economies. You can clearly see that growth is going to be higher. We expect growth to be higher in 2024 and 2025. But you can also see that once you take out India out of South Asia, which accounts for about roughly 3/4 of GDP and population, once you take out India, the rest of the region is actually not doing much better than other emerging markets and developing economies. And that is because the region includes, or 3 countries in the region are among the 1/4 of emerging markets and developing economies that are financially stressed. So here, the particular definition of financially stressed we use is that they're rated C or worse by Moody's, or that the IMF World Bank low-income country debt sustainability analysis rates them as in or near debt distress. You can see here in the center chart, if you just take the 3 financially stressed countries in South Asia and compare them to other financially stressed emerging markets, South Asia is doing pretty much in line. And that is what's dragging down growth for the region as well. There is a recovery, but it's not a soaring rebound. It's a muted recovery. The other Achilles heel of growth in South Asia is the composition of it, the sources of it. And that's what we capture here in the chart on the right. The red bar shows you the contribution of the public sector to growth in South Asia and elsewhere. And you can see that more than in other emerging markets and developing economies, growth is driven by the public sector, whereas the private sector languishes. Here you go. In the chart on the left, you see private investment growth, and chart in the center, you see the private investment share of GDP. So yes, private investment growth here on the left in South Asia is still higher than elsewhere, but it's far below what it used to be before the pandemic, so the 2015 to 19 window. That's a recent phenomenon, the slowdown in private investment growth. But this failure to contribute to GDP is a longer standing, or this weakness in contributing to GDP, that's a longer standing issue. You can see that in the chart in the center, it shows you the contribution of private investment to GDP. And you can see that in South Asia, even before the pandemic, it was much lower than elsewhere. Like somewhere between 5 and 10 percentage points lower, percentage points of GDP lower. So there is this decade of investment, of private investment weakness that seems to be on track to continue. So we did, in this report, we did an exercise, what would it take to kickstart an episode of a sustained private investment acceleration? These things are rare. They're on average in the average country, in the average year, there's only 4.5% probability that such an episode starts. But when they happen, they're truly transformative. That's when everything goes right. That's when you have private investment rising on average by 12% per year. That's for 8 years on average. These are long periods. That's when you have output growth accelerating. That's when you have poverty reduction. These are transformative periods. So we estimated what are the preconditions that make such an acceleration episodes more likely. And it turns out, well, there are 3 preconditions that are significantly correlated with one of these sustained private accelerations starting. One is openness to international trade and capital flows. The other is institutional improvements. And the third one is a well-aligned competitive exchange rate. So what matters for all countries in the region, especially the first 2, this openness and institutional improvements. Just to illustrate the room for improvement, we have the chart here on the right. It shows you a trade to GDP ratio in South Asia and emerging markets in developing economies as a whole. And it shows you also a very standard index of capital account openness, the Chin-Ito index. You can see South Asia has almost 30, in 2021-22 on average, had almost 30 percentage points of GDP lower trade to GDP ratios. And this falling behind other emerging markets is a long-standing issue. This is not just a post-pandemic issue. The region is much more close to international trade than other regions are. And the capital controls index, you can also see it's less than half of what it is elsewhere in the average emerging market and developing economies. So if we applied our econometric exercise to a little thought experiment, it could substantially increase the probability that one of these private investment acceleration episodes kick off. So, for example, if these blue bars and red bars of South Asia move to the EMDE average, so if trade openness and capital account openness move to the EMDE average, emerging market and developing economy average, the probability of kickstarting one of these transformative episodes where private investment also takes off, the probability would rise by almost 1/2. Now, without strong private investment, it's hard to see, it's hard to get climate adaptation, especially for firms. And that's what we show you in this chart here. Just as a reminder, there is no other emerging market and developing economy region that is as dependent, as vulnerable to climate change as South Asia. So Notre Dame University has this standard index that many people use now. And when you take the average for South Asia, you find that South Asia has the highest climate vulnerability index of all emerging market and developing economy regions. And just another factoid to bear in mind, for example, over the last 10 years, 60 million people per year on average were affected by climate damage. And that's 60 million, not always the same 60 million people. These are different 60 million people every year, and sometimes 200 million, sometimes it's fewer. It's a large number of people that is affected by climate damage every year. So, and it's more than any other emerging market and developing economy region. So climate adaptation is a priority. It's a policy priority for development. But we don't show it in this report, but we showed it in previous reports, and it's well known that governments in the region are very severely constrained. Their fiscal positions are fragile. Debt is high, revenue ratios are much lower than the emerging market and developing economy average, and borrowing costs are higher. So there's very little that governments can do to help with climate adaptation. Climate adaptation essentially falls on the private sector, households, firms, and farms. You can see them here in the chart on the left. So how do households, firms, and farms adapt to climate change? We have scoured the literature. We've looked at 5,000 studies. We've narrowed them to 324 studies. And then we've narrowed them a bit further to those that have quantitative estimates, another 52 studies. And we've done a meta-regression analysis. What do we learn from this vast literature of hundreds of countries? How do households, firms, and farmers adapt to climate change? And there are all sorts of outcomes that can happen: learning losses, income losses, mortality. So how do you compare these studies? Well, by this new ratio that we have developed, this adaptation ratio, it measures how much of climate damage is offset by this particular adaptation strategy. Turns out that firms are actually quite good at climate adaptation. There are the blue bars here in the chart. You can see that firms can offset about 3/4 of climate damage. The reason is that they have access to technology. Technology is very efficient in helping offset climate damage. So think of a heat wave, for example. Firms have access to air conditioning. They can do large-scale cooling so that labor productivity doesn't fall. More difficult for households, very difficult for farmers to do. So households and farmers are actually much less effective at climate adaptation. They can only offset somewhere between 1/3 and half of the climate damage. And the reason is that if they don't have governments to help them, the strategy they resort to is what we call labor market adjustment. Here, I think you can see it as a center chart, that tiny bar there. That is a move out of agricultural activities, mostly a move out of agricultural activities into non-agricultural activities. Yeah, into some sort of, sometimes it can even be migration, sometimes it's just changing jobs, but basically it requires a strong non-agricultural sector where people can move to adapt to climate change. And that's the bit that is missing in South Asia's labor markets. So I'm here for parsimony. I'm not showing you the aggregate employment ratio, but okay, one step back. In any other region, we would just be talking about employment. Employment growth would be good enough, but employment growth in South Asia is not good enough because the working age population is still growing at somewhere between 1 and 1.5 percentage points per year. So to really absorb this growing working age population, the employment ratio needs to increase. Yeah, so employment growth alone is not good enough. It needs to be faster than working age population growth. And that's what we capture with these employment ratios here. It's the share of employed in the working age population. Now, in the average emerging market and developing economy, that has stayed constant over the last 22 years, 2 decades, since 2000. In South Asia, it's fallen. And it's fallen because it's fallen among men. And women, that's very well known. For women, it's been low for decades, exceptionally low, like in the bottom quartile of emerging markets and developing economies, low. But for men, it used to be above average, and now it's just fallen to the average. Why did this happen? And that's the focus of the report here, and that's the focus of these two charts. When you think of development, you think of structural transformation. It's a move out of agriculture into non-agriculture. And you can see here in the chart on the left, the agricultural employment ratio. Agriculture is doing what agriculture does. It just sheds labor as it should. This is perfectly normal. This is what it's doing elsewhere. This is development. What's missing, the other wheel of that process that's missing is the non-agricultural sector, which you see in the chart in the center here. It's risen, but it's risen much less than in other emerging markets and developing economies. The gap has widened. So at this point, the non-agricultural sector employs 17 percentage points of the working age population less than in other emerging markets and developing economies. And it's not just like a little bit less, it's a lot less. And to show you how much less it is, we have the chart on the right. The red band shows you the interquartile range for other emerging markets and developing economies. And the blue bars are each of the countries. You can see the blue bars are all below the red range, which means that in almost all countries in South Asia, with one exception, Maldives, everywhere else, the non-agricultural employment ratio is in the bottom quartile of other emerging markets and developing economies. It's really very low. It's in the bottom quarter. So what can be done? What does this mean for policies? It means the burden of generating growth is really on firms. Yeah, vibrant, competitive firms are key to unlocking the job market. And that ties us back to private investment and also private climate adaptation. It turns out that these non-agricultural employment ratios are significantly correlated with three things that are particularly falling short in South Asia, which is firm size, trade to GDP ratios, trade openness, and literacy rates. In all three of them, most countries in South Asia score below the average for other emerging market and developing economies. And all three of these dimensions are significantly correlated with lower non-agricultural employment ratios. Firms are very small. Trade, you saw before, trade is low compared to other emerging markets. And in some countries, literacy rates are very low as well. So really, it comes down to having vibrant, competitive firms that grow from small to medium-sized, maybe because of competition from abroad. Trade can trigger this kind of competitive pressure and open markets to generate growth for firms. So the policy focus has to be on unlocking firm potential. Bottom line, to bring it all together, what's the growth outlook for South Asia? It's better than most in other emerging markets and developing economies, but mostly because of India. And it is more reliant on the public sector that's strained anyways than in other emerging markets and developing economies. Risks remain on the downside, including because of climate change. But to adapt to climate change, really the private sector will have to take most of the burden, which is okay for firms because they can access technologies and they're quite good at it. So, and there can be a further push to improve access to finance, help firms adapt technologies. The ones who are really being left behind are households and farmers. Because if the government doesn't give them public goods and public support, old-fashioned type of public goods, then they have to rely on the only other option they have, only other strategy they have, which is to move out of agriculture into a non-agricultural sector. That sector is not creating many jobs or creating fewer jobs relative to a working age population than it is in the rest of emerging markets and developing economies. To unlock this, we need to spur firm growth, really, and trade is one of the options to spur firm growth. Other complaints have been the efficiency of markets, size-dependent policies in labor, size-dependent policies in taxation, land markets. It's very difficult to acquire land, to grow your factories. So more efficient markets, greater trade openness. That's the call we make in the report. And with that, back to you, Sanjeev. Thank you.
Thank you, Francisca, for an excellent presentation. So before I proceed further, let me take the opportunity to introduce the two other panelists. So Lavish Bhandari is president and a senior fellow at the Center for Social and Economic Progress in New Delhi, a leading think tank in India. Prior to the current position, Lavish taught at Boston University and Indian Institute of Technology in Delhi. The other panelist is Ehsan Mansoor, a former colleague who is an executive director of Policy Research Institute of Bangladesh and chairman of BRAC and a bank in Bangladesh. Prior to assuming the current position, Ehsan spent several years at the IMF. So before we go down to our discussion, let me make a short announcement for the audience. They can submit their questions through Twitter at CGDev, hashtag CGDTalks, or email at events@cgdev.org, or on YouTube. These questions will be consolidated by our events team. So I plan to have 3 rounds of questions for the panelists, including Francisca, who will join us now in the panel. And so let me start with Francisca on a broader question. So you noted that South Asia has continued to grow more quickly than any other region. And earlier balance of payment pressures in several South Asian countries have now abated. But picture is not entirely rosy. So could we discuss, you laid out some policy packages for the countries to follow for the future. Could we discuss the underlying vulnerabilities that face South Asia, particularly in the face of changing geopolitics and prospects for the world economy? More precisely, in context of geopolitics, there is a lot of discussion about small yard and big fences. That is, especially as it pertains to trade policy. So given those geopolitics, how would you want to deal with the vulnerabilities facing South Asia?
Yeah, so these vulnerabilities are still holding back growth. That's one reason why they don't have the strong rebound that often happens after currency crisis. No, it's a moderate rebound. And they are on the external side, and a lot of them are on the fiscal side. Now, several countries still have reserves below 3 months of imports. The debt in the region on average, government debt, is the highest of any emerging markets in developing economy regions, so 80% of GDP. And a lot of it is domestically financed. Now, that does reduce the probability of crisis, but the catch is it absorbs the financing. It risks crowding out the private sector. And we showed in our last edition that the countries where a larger than median share of government debt is financed by domestic investors instead of foreigners, the share of bank credit that goes to the private sector is 6 percentage points less. So it is weighing that the fiscal burdens, the fragile fiscal positions, are weighing on the region, on the private sector activity in the region. That is one element, but another element is that some of the policies that were taken to reduce these balance of payment pressures are themselves holding back growth. So a lot of import controls were implemented, capital account restrictions, export, surrender requirements. Now, some of these have been wound back, but it takes a while for the private sector really to come back from them. So it really still weighs a bit on growth. So what is needed is really a big push to open up, allow in trade, invite trade, and re-energize the economy, at the same time restoring fiscal positions.
Thank you, Francisca. Let me turn to Ehsan. So the update talks about the challenges of increasing revenues to fund the SDGs and climate transition in South Asia. And this was a point which Francisca also made in her presentation. In Bangladesh, this has been an issue for many years. It was an issue when I was an IMF fiscal economist in the 90s. And then you took over as the advisor in the Bangladesh Ministry of Finance. And then you did a report for us on how to raise more revenues in Bangladesh. So in this context, what would you say are the more non-distortionary taxes you would recommend to Bangladesh to raise more revenues, given that currently the large share of taxes come from trade-related sources? Hassan.
Thank you, Sanjeev. And let me also first thanks Francesca for an excellent presentation and covering the issues very nicely. And in a nutshell, it speaks a volume for our region. Although India dominates, an Indian picture always overshadows all other component countries. In many cases, they are in opposite direction. Like reserves in India is growing fast, and every other country is falling. And if you lump it with India and make a ratio, it all looks very good. But anyway, she also tried to make some distinction in relevant places. Coming to Bangladesh, yes, I think the single most important factor which is undermining Bangladesh's prospect, and I keep telling to our governments that, look, without addressing the fundamental deficiencies in fiscal revenue collection, the administrative weaknesses and the policy weaknesses together, you will never be able to achieve your medium and long-term economic objectives. Tax to GDP ratio has been declining. It's not increasing since your time. and now, as of last year, it stood at 7.5% only of GDP. 7.5% is pathetic and pathetically low. So, total revenue to GDP ratio is only 8.5 to 9%. So it is awfully, and that constrains the deficit level. I mean, the overall spending level, because Bangladesh at the same time is fiscally reasonably prudent in the sense that fiscal deficit has always been below 5%, except for 1 or 2 years in the last 20 years. So it is fiscally quite prudent, but that means the size of the government and the government's role in the economy has been shrinking over time. This Awami League government, which came to power in 2009, at that time, the GDP size was, size of the government was something like 17, 18%. And it has been shrinking. Now it is standing at around 13%, 14%. So that is, you can do so little for it. If you come to climate change, for example, even to address that, you will need, in our estimation, in the estimation of the government, which was a document we prepared for the government, the Delta Plan 2100, 2.5% of additional expenditure would be needed just to implement the Delta Plan, which addresses many of the climate vulnerabilities issues and in the hotspots that is impacted by the private sector. But who's going to give the money? I mean, the tax to GDP ratio is falling. It's not increasing. Where from this additional resource will come? So, coming to the point that despite the fact that we have an IMF program, and our IMF colleagues have put a benchmark that every year GDP ratio has to increase by 0.5%. 1 year is gone. It has only declined by 0.3%. It didn't increase by 0.5%. So that is the situation on the ground. Now, so we had a meeting yesterday with the IMF technical team and all that. And basically, any tax reform measures that you will like to introduce will take at least 3 to 4 years. And that's beyond the IMF program period to give the results of that. So we have to think of some short-term measures. Tax rate increase is out of question. Bangladesh is not lightly taxed. It is inefficient tax system. And that's where the problem lies. And that's where we have to address. So we have agreed that only discretionary short-term measure is taking away the tax expenditure, reducing tax expenditures or exemptions, and there is substantial scope for doing so. So that is my recommendation to the finance minister in the budget discussion about 3 weeks ago, that every year, please cut down the exemptions by around 30,000 crore, and you will be at least buying time so that your tax to GDP ratio would not be falling, but maybe increasing by 0.1, 0.2% in relation to GDP. due to these discretionary measures. And in the meantime, you take real fundamental reforms, including automation, including streamlining of tax administration, and all those things which will be time consuming. And if 3 to 4 years time, once those things kick in, you will by that time reduce your tax expenditure to sufficiently low level. You have a more efficient, at least exemption system, and you can put in place a mechanism of increasing tax efficiency over the years in the years to come. So that is the strategy that we have been recommending to the government. Whether they will do it, and to what extent they will do something on tax expenditure, because IMF is pushing them strongly. So to what extent they will go, we want to see in the budget, which is coming next in early June.
Thank you, Hassan. I've done some estimates of tax expenditures in Asia, and on average, they are about 2%, depending on the availability of information. But they are mostly in two areas: corporate taxes and VAT. Both are politically very sensitive. So I won't go into the discussion on these two, but I just want to flag that issue. And I'll now turn to Lavish and move from fiscal to the financial sector, which is also important for creating jobs, because going back to what Francisca said, the firms have to create more jobs. They're more efficient in creating jobs and in dealing with climate change. So India's financial institutions provide less credit to the private sector as a share of GDP than other emerging market developing economies. So from all the work that you've done, how can India improve the functioning of financial sector by making it even more inclusive?
So I just like to just unpack things a bit. It's by the definition of inclusive can be variously interpreted. There is by some definitions, the levels of inclusion have gone up dramatically in the recent past. But yes, it is absolutely clear that you do need a more vibrant banking sector. You need it to be better regulated. You need greater competition there. You need more private sector banks. And all of that is absolutely clear, and it needs to be done. But that's just, again, one part of the story. Though some movements have happened there, there are regulatory weaknesses, which in a sense push towards greater public sector tendencies within the regulator as well as both the government. So there is that issue. Now, it's just opening up the banking sector, having greater private sector really doesn't work. And we've got global experiences to go by. You do need to have stronger ones. But having said that, if there is any country in the developing world which can have better quality regulation, it should be India. It has all the technical or like the financial skills. It has the human capital. It has the networks and so on. So clearly that is something that's important. But I'd also like to talk about the demand side. There is a very large public sector. The public sector in India has traditionally been in charge of the infrastructure, all the infrastructure sectors. That's where the bulk of Indian investment in infrastructure is coming from to the public sector. And a large part of it is, of course, public sector enterprises. Now, even if you can't privatize them, it would be great if these could be privatized, and that could also, create its own momentum. But even if you can't, you can actually make them more exposed to market forces. And that's clearly one area where reforms are required. Many governments have tried that. It has only succeeded partially, I believe, but it's something that definitely can be done far faster than a comprehensive program of privatization. So that's a second area. I'd like to mention a third one, especially in the context of environment related investments that are required. The MDB reform can actually play a very large role in enabling some of this kind of investment. As of now, the MDBs have contributed, but I think that they clearly can do much more. And it's also on the ability of firms within the country to be able to engage with NTBs, which is actually quite insignificant right now. So I think where there are avenues, action is required. There is a momentum of the past that is getting in the way. It will be very difficult to very quickly move into a market-driven financial sector, completely market-driven financial sector. But if, as I again said, if there's one country that can do it in the developing world, it would be India.
Thank you, Lavish. Let me go back to Francisca. In one of your slides, you talked about job creation. So South Asia's non-agricultural sector have not been absorbing as many workers as those leaving agriculture, as you said in your presentation. So what factors have contributed to the slow job creation in South Asia's non-agricultural sector, and what can we do about it in terms of policy priorities?
So we find all sorts of many correlates of the non-agricultural employment ratio. And in many of them, actually, the region doesn't do so badly. Which ranks somewhere in the middle. I mean, some countries are always outliers, but the region as a whole looks okay. There's three factors where the region as a whole looks weaker than the rest, and that are also significant correlates of non-agricultural employment ratios. So they're associated with lower employment ratios. That's firm size, that's trade openness, and that's literacy rate, or it's at various education indicators. So what can be done to improve firm size? That seems to depend on the type of firm. So if there are a bunch of small firms that they don't grow, you don't get much employment creation out of it. And the obstacle seems to be in the mid-sized firms that differ a bit in the things that they complain about from other firms in South Asia. For example, it's the mid-sized firms, not the large, not the small, it's just the mid-sized firms that complain about land markets. And these are basic things like a title, a digital registry, like a map that has all the, not just an address on your title, but there's actually a plot on a map that's associated with this address and with this owner. So these are things that are nuts and bolts that really hold back some of the mid-sized firms and prevent them from growing faster, growing bigger. And of course, in the size-dependent policies, labor restrictions kick in at a fairly low cutoff. So then they prevent firms from growing above. Some tax regulations perhaps have that too. So what can be done is simply to just start raising these thresholds a bit to allow firms to grow a bit further and then see what happens. This can be done a bit in a Chinese fashion, trying in one area, seeing the outcome, and then if it works, roll it out more broadly. But so that's on the firm size. Another big call is for trade openness, just opening up to trade. And that comes back to what Azan said about the tariffs, the tax revenues. The region relies much more on trade taxes than other regions to generate its revenues. The share of revenues in trade taxes is much higher than elsewhere, which makes it easier to collect in an economy that's very informal, but unfortunately it discourages trade. So a rebalancing towards some non-trade taxes could help on both fronts, both on growth and on revenues, if the tax basis of other taxes could be broadened.
Thank you, Francisca. So let me ask a similar question to Lavish. In India, boosting employment is a big issue. From your perspective, what policies are likely to yield quick dividends in creating more jobs?
Well, employment is something where it'll be very difficult to get quick dividends. And perhaps you don't want quick dividends because you want sustained employment growth. But if you look at the data, and some of the data was also reflected in what Francisca's excellent presentation showed, there actually has been in the last 4 or 5 years an uptick in employment in India. And this is the first time it's happened in the last 2 decades, despite significant employment growth across 2 decades. Now, we really haven't been able to figure out what really happened in the last 5 years. Is it the digitization of the economy? Is it that actually something internally just reached a tipping point and suddenly you started to see employment growth when you didn't in the past? I think we really need to understand that better right now. Now, if you just unpack the employment numbers, it also seems that all the growth is happening amongst the educated, and the reduction in employment is actually happening among those who are illiterate or uneducated. So that gives you a clue on where the challenges might be coming from and where the opportunities are. I think at this point in time, it'll be very difficult to say that I can change the educational establishment and suddenly start to have a highly educated, 100% literate population, because these things take time. Even if you, but if you just look at within the, let's say amongst the youth, the education levels are much higher than in the aggregate, and that gives us some cause for hope. So having said that you actually have the underlying situation quite well managed till now. The problem is that you don't have trickle down happening in employment. You've got it happening in consumption, but you don't have it. You're not seeing it in employment as much. And it's just a matter of, again, what has already been said, the way you tax, the way your internal trade is structured, the role of the public sector, how dynamic is the small scale sector, or for that matter, rural businesses, and so on. So there are a whole range of issues that need to be addressed. But the most critical part of it is, do you have a generally open market mechanism? Is our policies gearing towards that, or are policies curtailing that? And I think that is where what we need to focus on. I think there have been changes in the past. They may not have yielded things quickly enough, but that's the way to go. I'd just like to add one more thing. Mm-hmm. In many of these economic problems, an action today may not yield a result next year or 2 years later. And India's experience in the case of tax rates or tax reform shows that. Things that were done 15 years back are yielding payoffs now. And some things that were done 3 years back are yielding payoffs now. So you really can't predict when the payoffs will happen, but you still have to keep on doing it. And so that's something is also what's true for the tax. This thing is also true for employment conditions. And one last thing, land and labor markets and the role of the state, that is by far I feel one of the major areas across South Asia. We all need to ease the burdens on the market economy. Yeah.
Thank you, Lavish. Assam, Bangladesh is one of the few countries in the region where the working age population in employment has risen in the past 2 decades. So are there any lessons from Bangladesh experience that could benefit other countries in the region? And do you see any challenges emerging for job creation in Bangladesh?
Unfortunately, I'm not that optimistic about the future direction of job creation. Frankly speaking, yes, if you take the average of the last 10, 15 years, Bangladesh does well. But if you look at the last 5 years or 6 years, it is not done well. In fact, official statistics also indicates that the kind of job creation in the economy, which used to be in the range of 2.5, 2.3, 2.5 million per year, has declined to 1.5 to 1.7 million per year. And that is not, desirable, because the population growth is more than 2 million, to 2.2 million or so. So there is a problem. And the problem is because even the job creating industry like RMG, ready-made garments, is not creating jobs anymore. It is going through what we call labor saving technology, bringing new capital machineries, which are much more less labor intensive, and So you're generating exports, you're generating output, but not creating jobs in the process. So, and that sector is the major, most dynamic non-agricultural sector, and that is not creating jobs. Virtually stagnant, I would say, in the last 7-8 years. So that is an unfortunate situation we're facing in the country. And I don't know what the government is going to do, because investment in the private sector that Francisco was mentioning is the real problem in Bangladesh. The private sector investment GDP ratio has stagnated for all through these last 10, 15, 20 years at around 21 to 23% of GDP. And the increase that we have seen, a very small increase actually, is 3% or 3.5% over the last 10, 15 years, is only attributable to the public sector investment. And that is not going to create many jobs. And that's where the problem lies. Also, the SME sector and the policies towards the SME sector has not been at all effective. And much of the non-agricultural jobs are in the SME sector, but that's not doing well as well. And the tax policy is also not helping them in the way it has been designed, particularly with the distortions introduced in the VAT system, prevents large firms to even contracting out things to the smaller firms. Subcontracting is almost prohibitive because of tax on tax element that they have introduced by creating tax slabs, not allowing them to have credit for it in the VAT system. So why would anybody subcontract out something? They go for vertical integration. So it's really distortionary in that also. So I'm not very pessimistic that how you can really stimulate job growth, stimulate also future output growth in a significant, sustainable way without private sector investment, without FDI, which is also falling in relation to GDP every year. How can we really sustain the growth momentum, job creation momentum, et cetera, in the years to come?
Thank you, Ehsan. So let me turn to the final round of questions, and we have about 12 minutes. So we should perhaps limit our responses to about 3 minutes each. So Francisca, let me start with you. So how can one use public policies to accelerate private investment in climate adaptation? And I'm going to also add a question which came from an audience directed at you, which is that there is a lot of focus in the World Bank report on non-agriculture sector. But what about agriculture sector? What can government do to promote agriculture sector and its ability to adapt to climate adaptation? Because it seems the focus is shifted entirely to the other sectors. So I think it's a good question from the audience. So if you can respond in 3 minutes, I'll appreciate it.
Thank you. Yeah, so the public sector has a very big role in climate adaptation on the firm side to allow access, to facilitate access to technologies, because that's why firms are quite good at it. And that's why farmers and households are not so good at it. So even there, if government can find a way of giving farmers and households better access to technologies, and with that we even mean seeds, new varieties, drought-resistant seeds, irrigation, the public sector has a big role to play. In fact, we show that the public sector, if it wasn't for the public sector, the households and farmers would be even worse at adapting to climate change. And it's the old-fashioned type of public sector. It's the public sector who builds irrigation canals. It's the public sector who builds roads. So if one floods, there's another road. So people can still get to work. They can still get to the fields. They can still get to the farms. It's the public sector that builds or pipes water, which is still clean even when there's a flood. So there is a large role for the public sector. It's actually really important that the public sector become sustainable and can do its job. And the financial sector, what Lavish was saying before, that it's a bit unshackled from a lot of the restrictions that we also document in the report, that then can allow the firms better access to technologies.
Thank you, Francisca. Lavish, so sticking to the agriculture side, so what do you think India can do to make adaptation strategies more effective in the agriculture sector, such as switching to climate resilient crops? What kind of policy nudges would help in this regard?
So I think that's a great question. And I would say that some action is definitely required. Some action is already happening. And I'm not talking about just the government. There's also coming in from the market mechanism and so on. So first, you need to aggregate and coordinate farmer action. Now, the one way of doing that the government has chosen is through what we call farmer produce organizations, or FPOs, which aggregate the needs of a group of farmers, and they could be together in accessing seeds, accessing inputs, accessing capital, and also finding markets. Now, so you're essentially trying to create within a cooperative like situation a market mechanism to be able to do that. We still don't know how well they are working. The early results seem to say that there is some action and some successes happening there. The second is that you definitely need the government to have a more decentralized and a more flexible approach to purchases of food items. The government is the largest producer of agriculture output. And by I mean flexible, meaning that you need to have flexibilities of when you're purchasing and what you're purchasing. Especially farmers will need to start to use different seeds, will need to shift crops. What produce is available in the market would be different from what it was in the past. So the major purchaser, being the government, will also need to be flexible in this. So I think that would go a long way in at least facilitating the change, which needs to come from the farmer itself. I repeat, I mean, it should not be top-down driven shift. You just need to enable a situation where the farmers, if they decide, whichever way they decide, are also enabled. So that's the second part of it. The third is already again spoken about, is resilience. You may not be able to adapt quickly enough. And do you have the resilience or formal resilience mechanisms? There, I think that with the success in recent years of some financial inclusion tools, you have a possibility where the state can come up with possibilities where where resilience products can be better provided to the farming sector. And this can happen through the private sector and not necessarily through the public sector. So there are these possibilities. I'd like to just add one thing, and this has nothing to do with the question you asked, and that's to do with Ehsan's point. You know, I think the biggest opportunity for South Asia is to actually open up trade within itself. Yeah. A lot of opportunities exist there. We are by far the worst region in the world where internal trade between countries within the South Asia region are concerned. And it's something that we all need to really work towards. That is the only way you'll be able to really quickly get some positive outcomes on some of the things that you mentioned. Thanks.
Thank you, Ravish. Good point. And final question for Ehsan. And Ehsan, you have a fiscal background, and now in case of Bangladesh, the government, instead of raising more revenues, they've contracted the size of the government, which is really not very effective in terms of dealing with future challenges, or spending more on SDGs or spending more on climate adaptation. So if one were to consolidate, fiscal consolidation in South Asia region, and yet create room for this more productive spending, how would you go about doing it?
Thank you. This comes down to the same issue that you have to have more revenue, tax revenue in particular. And definitely there is a scope for improving quality of expenditure, but there limited scope for that. You cannot cut expenditure certainly for healthcare, where you spend only 0.7% of GDP. You cannot cut expenditure on education, which is only 1.7% of GDP. So you have to increase all those areas, fundamental areas, in poverty alleviation, infrastructure development. So you need money, and everywhere you look at, you need money. And so revenue mobilization is the only way I see for the government to really re-energize the economy, along with tax policy changes, along with protection is very high in Bangladesh, and that has to be dismantled in steps. But there is huge resistance from within, and we have created a strong protectionist lobby through import substitution industries that has developed over the years. So its political economy is extremely challenging in that regard as well. Coming to the Mr. Bandari's point that Bangladesh and South Asia needs to be integrated in terms of trade, I fully agree with that. That there is a long way to go, and despite the fact that Bangladesh exports only 1.25 billion and imports about 16-17 billion from India, I believe it is the state direction of trade is not the important focus. The focus should be on keeping trade facilitation in the top of the agenda. Why trade facilitation? Because it helps in many ways, particularly even the smaller countries, to keep their prices stability and agricultural supplies and so on. Bangladesh has done very well in agriculture, no question about it. And the policies like agriculture input subsidies, despite being a little bit costly, it has done very good things. We are now virtually, food self-sufficient in rice. We are virtually self-sufficient in animal protein products like and fruits and vegetable supplies has tremendously increased. So a lot of positive things can happen. Still, we need time to time import things from other countries, and India is a natural choice. But problem there is that whenever we need something like onion or green chili or something, there will be a trade restriction, export ban, and that is something really destabilizes our market. And prices shot up. Like onion prices were 60 taka, it went up to close to 200 taka per kg in overnight because India put an export ban. So we advised the government, and government also took it up with the Indian government, that can Bangladesh be exempted from your export bans, and so that we can remain integrated. We don't have to look for third country or fourth country supplies in a very short notice and destabilize our market. And it's a very sensitive political economy issue also. So I think we need to create an environment at least to give some degree of protection, that arbitrary suddenly election is coming, so all export of wheat, export of sugar, all those things have been banned from India, and we depend on sugar from India. We depend on wheat from India. We don't produce those things in Bangladesh, and we're extremely vulnerable. So I'm sure that other countries will feel the same way, smaller countries in the region, if they are impacted in the same way. So there are ways of mitigating it, but there needs to be much more political willingness to integrate, and the integration should not be compromised at the time of political economy issues or election issues like that from Indian side. India is a huge country. Any change in this policy can have a significant impact on countries like Bangladesh, which depends a lot on supplies from the big country.
Thank you, Hassan. So I had one more question which I wanted to throw in. I presume we can extend that discussion by a minute. Anybody, since the discussion is on job creation, anybody who would like to answer a question on the impact of artificial intelligence on job creation in 30 seconds? Very difficult question to answer in 30 seconds, but that's the time we have. Anybody who would like to? Tavish?
Yeah, sure. I'll give it a shot. there is a great opportunity in artificial intelligence, especially for countries where you have poor qualities of education, at least of the current cohort, because it does create a level playing field for those who have been less exposed to modern forms of education. At the same time, the kind of challenges that people are talking about would, I think, be more related to areas where, at least for countries such as ours, the exposures are less. So I think overall, this is going to be a great opportunity across South Asia and, of course, in India as well.
Thank you, Lavish. Thank you. So let me summarize in 1 minute some of the key points that have emerged. Of course, for the state to be able to spend more on climate adaptation and the SDGs, they need more revenues and more productive spending. And the suggestion from Bangladesh was to curb the granting of tax expenditures. But again, this is an issue which exists in all the countries. To what extent this can be restrained in a short period of time, it's an open question, but it's certainly a policy option. Then the other thing was to somehow cut back on the regulations on the private sector growth, especially the middle private sector, so that they can grow faster, they can access credit, and they can then create more jobs. And then the other point that came out is that we should not ignore agriculture sector. There are different things that can be done in agriculture sector. It's not a sector which should be ignored from policy perspective, and there are many different suggestions which were made by Lavish that can be implemented. And finally, there is the trade option of trade openness, which can help countries become more efficient, create more jobs, and so on and so forth. With this, I'd like to thank the panelists for an excellent discussion, and Francisca for the presentation and participating in the panel, and thank my colleagues at CGD for helping us out with this event. And thank you so much, and goodbye.
Thank you.